A merry and blessed Christmas to you all. It is so nice to see you here this morning. William Sloane Coffin, one of the great preachers of this past century, once gave a Christmas sermon, where he told the story of a man who arrived at the Canadian border just north of Detroit on his bicycle. And behind the man, on his bicycle rack, there was a large box full of sand. And when this cyclist got to the border, the customs official stopped him, looked at the box, and said, "What do you got here?" And the cyclist very casually said, "Nothing." So the official said, "Well, let's just see about that." And so he went and he carefully ran his fingers through the sand, and finding nothing, he sent the cyclist on his way. Well, just 3 days later, that same cyclist showed up again. And again, there was a big box on his bicycle rack. And the same customs official stopped him and said, "What do you got this time?" And the cyclist said, "Nothing." So this time, the customs official ran his fingers through the sand. He picked up the box, he dumped the sand out, he took the box apart, he shook all the parts, he shook the bike, and again, he found nothing. And for weeks, the same scene repeated itself, and the customs official was sure that he was going to find something, and he never did. Well, several years later, this customs official, now retired, was at a bar in Detroit having a couple of beers. And sure enough, he looked up from his beer and he saw a familiar face. It was that cyclist who had been bringing sand across the border all those years. And he just couldn't help himself, so he called the cyclist over, he sat him down, he bought him a beer, and he said, "Look, man, I'm retired now. It really doesn't matter to me anymore. I'm just curious. What were you smuggling across the border all those years?" And the cyclist looked at him with a faint smile, and he said, "Bicycles." The Christmas story tells the tale of how God's Son enters this world in an unexpected and unsuspecting way. There's no big royal birth announcement, no big trumpets blaring or anything like that, letting all the people know that God is now here. Rather, Jesus, God's Son, enters this world in the form of a vulnerable baby born to poor parents in a backwater town of the Roman Empire. No one in a position of authority or power would hardly have ever noticed. And yet, it's this birth that invites us into a new age, a new time, where God's goodness and peace and justice are made known. The gospel lesson we heard for this morning, the Christmas story, starts out with the words, "In those days." Just kind of sounds old-timey, doesn't it? In those days. And right after those days, we hear about two Roman political figures. Caesar Augustus, who was the Roman emperor at the time, the guy who issued this registration, the reason that Mary and Joseph had to come to Bethlehem, and also Quirinius, the military governor of Syria at the time. Now, it's important to point out that from the perspective of the author of the Gospel of Luke, the Roman imperial system at the time dominated the Mediterranean world through violence and through exploitation. So this story, Luke tells a story starting off in those days by naming the powers that be. Those guys who were in authority and were responsible for this violent and oppressive political system. Those days represent an old time, a time that was shaped by the power structures of the day. So this is how our story kicks off. In the old time, in those days. But there is a significant shift in this story after Jesus' birth. In the verses after Jesus is born, we hear the angels say, "To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior." This day is a pronouncement that something new has taken place, something that moves us away from those old ways of being and ushers in a new age, a new time, a time that's not defined by the threat of the imperial system, but rather a time that is defined by the inbreaking of God's kingdom, a time that's characterized by good news of great joy for all people. A new Savior has arrived. Savior being a title that's usually reserved for the emperor. A new Messiah is in town, one that will deliver the people from occupation and oppression. A new reign has begun. A reign that we hear this morning is first announced to the outcasts of first century society, to the shepherds in the darkness of night. And the very first words spoken after Jesus' birth are addressed to these outcast shepherds. "Do not be afraid," the angel says to them. It's a phrase that the angels say on multiple times throughout Luke's gospel. And it's an indicator that this new age is not characterized by the fear and the oppression of the old days, but rather this is an age defined by freedom and joy. The powers that be in both Jesus' day and even in our day too often play on fear and use fear to get at what they want, whether that be fear of the emperor and the threat of violence, whether that be fear of the other, fear of immigrants, fear of you name it. But the good news of the Christmas story is that through Jesus, or through Jesus' birth, God shows us that we should not let fear imprison us. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, explains that the Christmas scene, the scene of the little baby Jesus lying in the manger, gives us a glimpse into the very engine room of how God works. It gives us a glimpse into the very nature of God. A God who is willing to completely empty God's self of all the things that we might expect God to have, glory and power and might, in order to become a helpless little baby so that we might be drawn into relationship with him. A God who so completely gives God's self away so that we might meet him as a baby born to poor parents in a stable. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. The Christmas story reveals the true nature of God, this complete outpouring of love. And Jesus, throughout his life and his ministry, embodies this outpouring as he pours himself out in compassion and mercy and justice, even to the point of being put to death on a cross. Jesus doesn't just tell us, Jesus shows us the unimaginable length that God is willing to go to be in relationship with us. And this allows us to face the fears that surround us, knowing that no matter what, God is with us. Our participation in this new age, this new time that Jesus' birth ushers in, requires a dependency on that overflowing and outpouring of God's life-giving nature. Often, I think, in our modern society, in our hyper-individualized culture, we tend to have a negative view of dependency. We look at dependency with some skepticism, maybe even some concern and pity. We might think of people who are dependent on drugs and alcohol, people who are dependent on handouts. But there's a completely different way of looking at dependency, because in one way or the other, we are all dependent on certain things in order to live. We are dependent on the air we breathe. We are dependent on food and water. We are dependent on the people around us, our loved ones and our families, to help us learn and to help us grow. And so too are we dependent on God's nature that brings life into this world. Just as Jesus was dependent on the outpouring of God the Father's life and creativity, so too are we. Jesus' birth reveals this overflowing of love that is God's nature, that transforms our lives and delivers us from these old days into the new days. And when we recognize our dependence, how we rely on God and one another to learn and to grow, we begin to realize that we're all in this together, that we're all called to be children of God, that there is no us versus them. There is only an us, learning and growing into the endless life and joy that is God. Merry Christmas.